Thank you, and good morning. So I'm very privileged to be here today to talk to you about the power of big data and psychographics. My name's Alexander Tayler, and I'm the Chief Data Officer of a company called Cambridge Analytica. So for those of you who haven't heard of us, Cambridge Analytica is a data science consultancy with a really heavy specialization on the communications and marketing industry. And the work that we do at Cambridge is enabled by three key technologies in the IT space. And if I can get the clicker to work. Okay. So those three key technologies are, firstly, the prevalence and emergence of big data. And by this, I mean enormous data sets which are being accumulated by companies all over the world throughout their interactions with their consumers. I'm talking about the emergence of large-scale big data aggregators like Experian and Axiom, who are taking data from all sorts of sources and bundling them together in a package that can be bought off the shelf. I'm talking about governments open sourcing their data, the emergence of social media, all of these data providing the ingredients for data science companies to do what we do. The second key technology is the emergence of widespread, cost-effective, high-performance computing. Today, through cloud computing services like AWS, it's possible for anyone with a couple of $100 to go and spin up a server and start to solve data science problems on a challenge, which only 10 or 15 years ago would have required hundreds of thousands of dollars of capital investment. The last key technology is really the maturation of open source machine learning libraries, which has just lowered the barrier for anyone with an interest and a bit of a background in data and computer science to get their hands dirty with solving problems. And over the course of today, there's going to be many talks which dig down into detail in all of these areas. Before you do that, what I'd like to do is to take a step back and talk about what we can achieve by taking this confluence of technologies and applying it to solve a really particular problem. Next slide, please. The particular problem that we solve at Cambridge is the fact that the communications industry fundamentally hasn't really changed for the last 60 years. Back in the 1950s, in the days of the Mad Men, communications, advertising was really a top-down creative process. You would have a team of creative geniuses sitting around a table, coming up with an advertising ad or a slogan that's going to sell 1 million tins of baked beans. Today, with all of the data which is available about consumers, it's no longer necessary for this to be an exercise in guesswork and creativity. You can start with a very deep quantitative understanding of your audience, and then use that to get 90% of the way to understanding about how to communicate with those people, what sorts of messaging they're going to engage with. And that's what we do at Cambridge Analytica. Next slide, please. In terms of how we do this, we as a company really have 3 core competencies. And what I'd like to do over the course of the next half an hour is to talk you through each of these areas, making things as concrete as possible with lots of examples, before I give a couple of case studies at the end. So the first of these areas, next slide please, is data science. Next slide. Data science, as we see it, really involves combining 3 different types of data. The first of these is what we call third-party data. These are data which are available from big data aggregators such as Experian, Axiom, IRI, Ninth Decimal, which are companies that ingest data through their partnerships from newspaper and magazine publishers, supermarket loyalty card schemes, and make available commercial files in the US covering everyone in the population in large amounts of detail about their lifestyles, their consumer habits. It's data from social media, it's data from other sources. And in fact, by going out and pulling together all of the open data that we're able to find, by licensing the consumer files from those big data companies, we at Cambridge have been able to build an enormous database of record containing some 4,000 or 5,000 data points on all 240 million adult consumers in the United States. We combine that with next slide, we combine that with first-party data. So that is data which our commercial or political or social clients have collected themselves through their own engagements with their customers. So these data are very deep, but very narrow. So that is, it tends to be every touch point, every transaction that a company has in engaging with their customers. And so there's a really lovely complementary interaction between the deep and narrow first-party data and the very broad but shallow third-party data that provides you with all of this context around those individuals and what they do when they're not engaging with your brand. The third type of data that we deal with, next slide, is large-scale quantitative market research. So by quantitative research, I mean we will design a survey and then go out and get tens of thousands of people to answer a questionnaire. And this is a very valuable thing to do because it's incredibly flexible, the type of information that you're able to probe with this sort of a research instrument. And the type of research that we design covers conventional market research, attitudinal and opinion research. It can be more in-depth behavioral research, or it can start to draw on our unique ISP, the behavioral sciences work, which I'll come on to talk about in a moment, and actually take elements of applied psychology and bake that into a research instrument alongside other brand and attitude and competitor questions to shed a very deep and nuanced light on consumers and the way they behave the way that they do. So from the combination of these three types of data, next slide, we use machine learning to fill in the blanks, if you like, to interpolate and extrapolate, to take those unlabeled data points and then make predictions about everyone in the population, about what sorts of products and services they're in the market for, about what sorts of messaging they're going to engage with. And as a marketing agency, next slide, our goal in doing this is to enable us to provide our clients with different types of customer segmentations. So this can be socio-demographic or consumer, or at a lower level, and I'll come on to give some examples of this, psychological segmentations that then allow them to go off and run highly targeted, high-impact marketing campaigns. Next slide. So to come around to the second thing that we do as a company, the behavioral sciences research. Next slide. What we do here is we seek to take out of the academic literature models for all of those traits that make up the rich tapestry of human psychology. So if you think about the scores, the traits that quantify the way a person behaves as being like an iceberg, the part of the iceberg that pokes out above the water, that's observable, this part would correspond to the data which is readily measurable. So the stuff that you can go and buy off the shelf from a company like Experian. So the demographics, the media consumption, the consumer behavior. What we seek to probe with our research is the much bigger piece of the puzzle that sits below the surface. So that is all of these models that the whole field of applied psychology seeks to quantify, things like personality, emotionality, need for cognition, locus of control, all these different traits that really govern the way that people behave. I'll give an example. Next slide, please. This is a high-level behavioral model called the theory of planned behavior. It was developed in the early 90s by a psychologist whose goal was to come up with an explanation for how people behave in those situations where a lot of cognitive, rational thought goes into deciding what they're going to do. So as an example, if you're thinking about buying a car, that's an example of the type of situation where the theory of planned behavior might be a good starting point. So the idea of this model is that any planned behavior is preceded by an intention, and in order to form that intention, you have to have three things in the right place. There can't be any controls or blockers preventing you from forming that intention or undertaking the behavior. You have to have the correct attitudes and opinions towards the brand or the product or the behavior, and your normative environment. So that is what your friends and family would think about you undertaking this behavior needs to be in a good place. So to give some examples, let's say our client is Mercedes. It's a premium brand. Next slide, please. An example of a behavioral control for Mercedes would be that there's some people in the population who simply can't afford the product. Using the data and the research, we would seek to identify those audiences who have got this behavioral control and then put them in an exclusion audience, so you're not wasting money serving advertisements to someone who couldn't buy the product even if they want to. Next slide. And that's in juxtaposition to a perceived behavioral control. So this might be an audience of people who believe they can't afford the product, but they're not aware of the range of financing options available. So then we seek to label those individuals and put them in a bucket where they receive a type of messaging that helps them understand their pathway through to buying a Mercedes. Next slide, please. Norms, as I mentioned before, this is about your friends and family not looking negatively on the behavior. Next slide. And attitudes, of course, you as an individual have to have the correct disposition before you'll form that intention. Next slide, please. And in each of these three different areas, there's always an element of persuasion. So that is trying to talk to people and trying to get them to change their mind or their opinion. And a very powerful way of doing that sometimes is to go a layer deeper in the psychology and to profile people in terms of some behavioral driver, such as personality, such that you know how to frame your messaging and communications with them. So this model here is called OCEAN, or the Big Five. It's the state-of-the-art of quantifying personality as has been developed by the field of applied psychology. It's a little bit like taking a Myers-Briggs personality inventory, if anyone has had to do that before. But the idea of this model is that any given person's personality can be quantified in these 5 key scores. Openness, whether you're open-minded and suggestible to new ideas and experiences. Conscientiousness, which is whether you prefer spontaneity or plans and order in your life. Extroversion, which is whether you like to be the center of attention in the life of the party, or whether you draw your energy from being by yourself. Agreeableness, which scores whether you think about yourself or other people, first and foremost. And neuroticism, which is sometimes called emotional stability. It's how strongly you react to a strong emotional stimulus. So if you insult me, do I get angry or do I not worry? That's the type of thing that the neuroticism dimension captures. Next slide, please. And so, in taking a quantitative instrument that allows us to measure personality, putting it into a market research instrument, having 10,000 people take that survey, and then model out personality across the rest of a group of consumers, it allows us to do 2 things. The first is, it allows us to take 2 groups of people who might have the similar demographic or consumer factors, two groups of people who under a conventional segmentation strategy would be bundled in together, but because deep down in the nonlinear combination of all of those thousands of data points we have about them, we might actually make the prediction that the group of people on the right are extroverts, and the group of people on the left are highly neurotic, people who are high in conscientiousness. And then our whole hypothesis as a company is about the fact that you shouldn't be lumping people together on the basis of gender or consumer behaviors. You should be sticking people together on the basis of their personality. So it's a fundamentally different way of undertaking audience segmentation. Next slide. It's also a fundamentally different way of structuring your advertising. So from all of the research that went into the development of the Big Five model, we know that people who are highly extroverted are people who like the idea of being at the center of attention. These are the type of people who respond strongly to messaging that places them at the center of the frame, maybe out in the world having an exciting adventure. Next slide, please. So for example, for a client like Mercedes, we might recommend that through the tone and the imagery and the language in their advert, perhaps something that places them having a race day in the newest model Mercedes. Next slide. And that's in contrast to the sort of messaging that we would use on a neurotic, conscientious audience. People who are high in conscientiousness are persuaded by transparent, fact-led messaging. People who are highly neurotic are often motivated by fear and insecurity. Next slide. And so for that audience, it might be a message about the safety features of the car and how it's going to help you avoid an accident. Next slide. And that's the type of thing that we do in the behavioral sciences space. The last thing that we do as a company is we are actually an ad agency. We do buy media and execute campaigns ourselves. And that's what we mean by targeted engagement. It's taking the audiences from the data science, it's taking the clues about how to communicate with those audiences from the behavioral sciences, and then we use the best in modern addressable ad technology to get the right message to the right person. Next slide, please. We do this through 3 channels: digital advertising, addressable TV, and optimized linear broadcast TV. Firstly, I'm just going to talk you through each of these 3 technologies one at a time, then I'll talk you through the process about how we execute. Next slide. So in the digital space, and this slide is purposely overwhelming, so don't worry too much. In the digital space, there's this incredible ecosystem of platforms and services that allow you to do different things. I'm talking about DMPs, DSPs, retargeting networks, publisher networks, all these different moving pieces. We, as a full-service agency, take care of all of that. So what we enable our clients to do is simply to work with us to do the research and the data science piece, to give us better ingredients than what other ad agencies are able to do. Then we take care of all of the nuts and bolts. We've got an ad tech stack with about 35 different platforms in it. And we go off and we run high-impact, cross-platform digital campaigns. So social, display, search, video, everything. Next slide, please. When I talk about addressable TV, I'm talking about the 50% or so of the US population who can be served addressable ads through their cable or satellite TV system. So that's to say that you and your next door neighbor could be watching the same TV show at the same time, but each of you would see a different advert. And we're plugged into the 6 big MVPDs in America and the 2 big ones in the UK that enable you to serve this type of individually addressable television advertising. Next slide, please. For the rest of the population who aren't covered by addressable TV, we have to do something slightly different. Here, we're partnered with companies like ComScore and TiVo. These are companies who have got access to data about what TV shows each household is watching, which is being transmitted back to them via a TiVo box, for example. And by combining our audience segmentation with those data around what different households are watching, together with information about geographic audience density and pricing data on how much it costs to buy each advertising slot in each program by geography, we're able to run an optimization routine that allows us to still buy TV advertising by geography and by time slot, but to do it in the most efficient, data-driven way possible. So for example, in the work that we did in the United States, working for conservative Republicans, we were able to show that key target audiences that our client were trying to reach, they were as likely to watch The Sound of Music at 2 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon as they are to watch The Today Show. But of course, The Today Show is a piece of expensive premium inventory. The Sound of Music costs about a third of the cost. And so it's about teasing out those low-hanging fruit, just making those broadcast media budgets go as far as possible. Next slide, please. In executing with these 3 technologies, we run a fairly conventional type of sales funnel, but with a behavioral sciences twist. Next slide. So the first step in the funnel, the first pieces of advertising that you serve to a fresh audience are really about cutting through the noise of advertising that these people are exposed to every day. Messaging in this phase should be attention grabbing. The 3 fundamental grabbers of attention, faces, food, and fornication, we'll call it, should be heavily used. Anything that's emotive or self-relevant, any sort of personalization is great for grabbing people's attention. At this point, you're not trying to drive clicks, you're just going for reach and frequency. You're trying to get, say, 6 impressions out across the internet, just trying to get people to sink into their subconscious that this product or this service is out there. And for that reason, display advertising, social display, pre-roll, these are great tools to use for the first phase of this campaign. Next slide. The second phase, once you've already primed your audience with half a dozen pieces of awareness material, the messaging starts to become more narrative-driven, maybe more mysterious. At this point, you're really optimizing around driving clicks, around driving completed views of a Facebook ad. And the media channels change. Now it's social video, high-impact interactive, native. Next slide, please. And then finally, when you reach the last stage of the funnel, so this is for the people who have had the 6 pieces of display served to them. Maybe they've clicked on an ad or they've watched an entire video on Facebook. If you've gotten someone to this point in the journey and now they're searching for a keyword which is relevant to your brand, it's expensive, but you want to have that premium search listing come up at the top of their search results. So it becomes about search, it becomes about email, the messaging changes, now it's stronger calls to action, you're optimizing now around conversion, and you're really trying to push people to get them over the line. Next slide, please. And that's what we do. We're an end-to-end, data-driven marketing agency. We put this into play in 3 spheres: commercial, social, and political. These are just some typical results from our commercial and social work. On the commercial side, this is a result from a client of ours in the insurance industry. They do a lot of email and social media marketing. Their average email open rate was around 14%, which they felt happy with. Their best performing social ads were clicking through at about 3%, which again they thought was pretty good. What we were able to do by profiling their audience, providing them with a new segmentation and guidance about how to engage with those new segments, was to lift their email open rate by 6 points on average. That's by customizing the subject line. We were able to almost double the click-through rate on their best performing social ads. So, that was a happy client. Slightly differently, we've been doing some work with a charity in America whose goal is to promote traditional social values. They want to decrease the divorce rate, increase rates of church attendance, bring back solid traditional families to the United States. And so they hired us to profile people in the United States at risk of getting a divorce, and then to target them with messaging, to engage with them, to get them to consider marriage counseling. We did this across 3 cities as a test: Jacksonville, Florida, Dayton, Ohio, and Phoenix, Arizona, where we ran our messaging in those cities and then used the rest of the state as a control group. And so as you can see here, between 2015 and 2016, whereas the divorce rate in Florida only dropped by 0.1%. In the city where we were running our messaging, it dropped by around 17.5%. So, it's a remarkable result, and it just demonstrates the power that exists in pipelining data straight through to engagement. Next slide, please. Now, of course, the thing that Cambridge Analytica is most famous for is the work that we did for Trump for America last year. Before we get into this, I'd like to preface it by stating that actually we're a nonpartisan company. Every year around the world, we do between 6 and 12 political campaigns from left and right. It just so happened there was a market opportunity on the American right, and we found ourselves working for Mr. Trump. Next slide, please. What we did for the Trump campaign was really end-to-end, all of the services which I've just spoken about. We were able to do this because when we started working for the Trump campaign in June last year, they had made very little investment into data or technology or ad targeting, and us having just run the primary campaign for Senator Ted Cruz, we had an awful lot of technology and experience that we were able to lift and shift over into his presidential campaign. So in terms of a process, it all started with research, which we both used to report back to the campaign to give them a daily tracker poll about the electorate. That research also fed into our models in combination with other data. Those models fed a segmentation scheme, which we then used for digital and television engagements on the behalf of the campaign. Next slide, please. On the research side, we were running on the order of 1,500 completes in each of the 16 battleground states. We've got a fairly sophisticated scheme for designing representative audiences and then going through and correcting the biases that tend to creep into the data over the course of sampling. We tend to take larger sample sizes than most conventional pollsters, and this is simply down to the statistics of the problem. And so, next slide, please. In running this ongoing research and doing some very sophisticated sample bias correction and data processing, we were able to supply the campaign with reporting dashboards such as this. So this is an example of the type of dashboard that allowed them to see on a day-by-day basis how the electorate was responding to different changes in the field of play. This is, of course, very important because if there's a scandal or an event, you need to know which states are suffering from that event and which ones are relatively immune to it, such that campaign decision makers can make educated decisions about the deployment of resources and where they should be running damage control and where things are okay. Next slide, please. In terms of using the research to fuel models, the types of models that we were building are shown here. In the first phase of work, it was all about modeling donors and trying to help the campaign raise funds. We then moved on to modeling candidate preference, propensity to turn out, propensity for unregistered voters to be convinced to register, to vote, and vote for the first time. And then the final phase is all around modeling what social and political issues are important to each voter on an individual level. Next slide, please. And having developed these models, having developed these models and applied them to the entire electorate, please maybe have the next slide, thank you. That allows us to start to segment up the voting populace in a variety of different ways. To give you an idea, on the x-axis of this graph is a scale that would rank people from -1 being definitely going to vote for Hillary Clinton through to +1 being definitely going to vote for Donald Trump. The y-axis is propensity to turn out and vote. So people in the top right-hand corner are people who are definitely going to vote and are definitely going to vote for your candidate. So you shouldn't waste time or money trying to persuade them to vote a certain way. You should be soliciting a donation or trying to get them to attend a rally or an event or to become an advocate, to share something on social media. Slightly down the turnout spectrum, the audience labeled GOTV. These are people, GOTV, for those of you who don't know, stands for Get Out the Vote. It means those people who will vote your way, but they're unreliable voters, so you're just trying to mobilize them. The big audience in the middle is a very important one. These are people who are likely to vote, but haven't made up their mind yet. So here you're trying to persuade them that your candidate is the candidate who's going to best represent them in government. Next slide, please. Then for each of these top-level segments, please, next slide. For each of these top-level segments, we then broke down those audiences into subgroups of people who cared about the same issue as each other, such that we're able to talk to them about what issues they care about with the right message, either to persuade them or move them to vote. Next slide, please. And of course, this was a closed end-to-end cycle. We were continually running fresh research, updating the models, updating the segmentation, so we could track people as they responded to certain types of messaging, became more convinced to vote one way or the other, and be continuously readjusting resources. Next slide. Just to give a few results, on the TV side, we were splitting the TV budget between us and a more conventional political TV buyer. Of course, us, with our data-driven buys, we were able to do much more interesting and impactful things than what's possible just from an experienced professional using their intuition and experience to know what to buy. And in fact, the day after the first TV buy that we ran went live, Advertising Age, which is a big industry publication in the US, ran an article completely independently of any information about the fact that we were launching these campaigns, stating that for the first time, the Trump campaign is running TV buys that are deep and nuanced and are actually competitive with what the Democrats are doing. Next slide, please. On the digital side, Facebook and Google provide you with some really nice tools for doing what's called a brand lift study. So that is, they'll allow you to hold aside a control group who don't receive messaging from a particular campaign, and then they allow you to measure things such as increase in favorability, which they probe by running micro-surveys, increase in surf traffic, and through running these brand lift studies with our partners at Google and Facebook, we're able to show results such as this. For our messaged audience, a 11% increase in favorability, an 8% increase in intent to vote for Mr. Trump, almost a 20% uplift in search activity amongst those managed audiences. Next slide. And on the execution side, just a few quick results. Running throughout the entire campaign, we were always doing fundraising, list building. We built lists of almost 1 million emails. We raised almost $30 million for the campaign. We drove people to his rallies. We drove 35,000 app installs. We served billions of impressions across the entire country. We had an incredibly strong push on what's called ABEV. ABEV stands for absentee ballot / early voter. And amongst those ABEV votes, and you could see those postal ballots coming in advance of the election, we drove a 2% increase in votes amongst those audiences. And then in the final stretch of the campaign, it was all about persuasion, mobilization, getting people to turn out and vote for your candidate on election day. Next slide, please. And that's what we did. There's been a lot written about the work that we've done on the campaign. There's been a lot of erroneous information published. People, when they're taken by surprise by an election result, they tend to try to find a convenient, easily understandable explanation for what happened. And one of the things that they've latched onto is the idea that we used psychology to manipulate people into voting for Trump, which we didn't. Actually, we didn't use any sort of psychographic messaging at all. It was only issues and turnout and candidate based. This was simply down to the fact that we only had 5 months between when we started working election day. There was no time. We don't do fake news or Twitter botnets. It's just complete rubbish. What we do is the things which I've talked you through here today. It's best practice, research, data science, and the best of modern addressable ad targeting. And it's a powerful formula. So with that, next slide, please. I'll thank you very much for your attention. And if we've got a couple of minutes for Q&A, I'm very happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you very much. And we have a time for a couple questions from our audience, please. Who want to answer a question? Okay, I can see the first question. Just a second. Please tell your name and the question.
Hello, everyone. My name is Antonina. I'm from SoftServe, and I've got a question to you. Thank you for your speech. This is the first point, and the question is, you were talking about the ocean approach, and as for me, this is very hard to understand how to measure and where to search for the analysis of the neurotic features of the personality, because conscious emotionality, maybe extrovertness, it is possible to measure somehow and to search for this type of information in social media, some maybe analyzing the behavior of the person. But what about the neurotic features?
So just to be clear, you're asking how you measure neuroticism?
Yes, and where to search for this information in order to compile the clear persona of your customer.
Yeah. So there's a couple of different ways. The traditional way of quantifying these traits, so all of them, including neuroticism, is actually there are particular key statements that people say describe them or don't describe them, that are supposed to probe this dimension. And this survey-driven approach to quantifying the traits, if you're interested, actually you can go to our website, ocean.cambridgeanalytica.org, and you'll see there a questionnaire that enables you to score yourself in terms of these traits. It gives you a nice little report to tell you what your ocean score is. And so it'll be statements like, I don't know, I tend to worry about things a lot. I get angry easily. I have a short fuse. Those are the type of questions that in aggregate, by asking, there's maybe 6 to 10 questions with a special scoring methodology behind it, allow you to quantify that dimension. More recently, actually, researchers moved beyond just the sort of survey-based approach where you ask people questions. There's a lot of work that's been done to show that from written text, so what people write on social media or in blog posts, that from the language they use, you can infer these personality traits. There's a couple of companies doing facial recognition technology that measure personality and emotionality from the expressions on your face. So there's a few different techniques out there. Does that answer your question?
Next question, please. Yep, here.
Hello, I'm Michael, also from SoServe. My question is, you say that you analyze text that people post in the social medias. I know we can analyze Twitter, some other, but what about Facebook? It's open or closed? How you analyze this data? And this is part of the bigger questions, because I don't think in Ukraine we have enough data sources. You say that you have like about 5,000 sources of different data, and how you gather, you can gather if you don't have access.
Okay, so if I understand you, you've asked two questions. The first is about analyzing Facebook data, and the second is about what we do in countries like Ukraine, where there's not vast amounts of third-party data available off the shelf. Facebook, of course, have got amazing data covering everyone in the world. Unfortunately, only Facebook have got access to those data. The days of the version 1 Facebook API where people were pulling data down and doing offline things with it are long gone. If you want to advertise on Facebook's platform, you have to play by their rules, and their rules are you don't offboard data. So we don't work with Facebook data offline. We work with other sorts of data, and then we onboard custom audiences to Facebook, and then we can do some interesting things on the Facebook platform, but we can't take an offline Facebook data set and work with it. It's not allowed. So then, what do we do in a country like Ukraine, where there isn't an enormous file of individually resolved data covering everyone in the populace? Well, we do a similar program, but at a different level of granularity. So it's no longer now at the individual level, but there's still generally quite good open data resolved to postcode level, so a couple of thousand people. Even in countries where those data don't exist, we can go and we can run large-scale quantitative research. So we've just done an enormous piece of work in Africa where we had tens of thousands of survey completes profiling each precinct about people in that region and what they care about. So then, while your outreach is no longer necessarily individual, it's still very, very granular. So it might be groups of hundreds of thousands of people. It just depends on what ingredients are available and what you're able to do with them. So it really does vary by geography.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Julian from Northgate Arinzo. How do you deal in your model for people self-censoring themselves? They don't want to admit, for example, they vote for Trump, so they don't share it on Facebook. How can you find what people really believe if they don't share it?
So you're talking about people opting out?
Yeah, people that will not do, for example, on internet what they really think about. They will not share with their family or not talk about something because they believe it's not in the norms.
So what do we do for those people who have opted out and we have no data on them? Well, I mean, of course, increasingly people are more and more in control of their own data. With GDPR coming on in Europe next year, that's going to be more powerful than ever, taking people's data and giving them control over it and giving them the ability to really control who's able to use their data and for what purpose. So it's a very relevant question. What do we do when people have said, no, I don't want you to use my data for targeting me? And the simple truth is, for addressable, data-driven marketing, we can only use it to talk to those people who are in some way as part of that data-driven ecosystem. If people opt out of it or they remove themselves, then we would still talk to them through conventional channels, but it wouldn't have the same level of one-to-one personalization.